This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. I thought this would be an interesting experiment. So I know for a lot of us, I think sometimes we can spend quite a bit of time or energy sort of chasing pieces of gear. Now I'm as interested in gear as I think anyone else might be, and obviously part of running this channel means that I do buy quite a lot of bits of gear. And one thing that I see come up fairly often is that you make everything sound the same. And in some ways, I kind of think of that as a criticism, and I don't really necessarily like it when people say that. Especially when part of what I do is sort of demo like the variety of things that these things can do. So, sometimes I might be playing jazz on a Vox AC30 Fender Princeton preset. Other times I might be playing something on like a Rev generator amp or whatever like that. So I think to some extent, if someone says everything sounds the same, it would, to me, be a bit of a negative, because hopefully I should be able to show clear differences where there are some, right? But I do think there's a bit of truth to this. And I think what we can't escape in some ways is that our ears gravitate towards certain tones. So for me, like I showed you in the introduction there, for me, my kind of home when I'm playing these kind of legato lines is something that on the bridge pickup sounds pretty full, sounds pretty smooth, and has a lot of gain. Now this can be achieved in a lot of different ways, and what I was doing in the introduction there, I went through Line 6 Modern, through the Archetype, the PRS Archon essentially. I went through Helix Native through my usual tone, which is kind of like pushing the front end of the litigator, which is like the Ben Adrian's sort of take on a Dumble style concept. Then 3 was through Archetype Pliny, the Neural DSP plugin, and 4 was through Scuffum X Gear, through the Dumble style amplifier on that. While they don't sound exactly the same, I feel like they're all pretty much in the ballpark of that specific thing which kind of sounds like me. I think, let me know in the comments if you think any of them sounded like, oh, that didn't really sound quite like what John would usually do, or one that stood out. So if I really wanted to make these things sound different, then I definitely could. But what I'm thinking is that when each of us goes into these kind of plugins, modelers, whatever we're using, we are sort of looking for our sound to some extent, right? And so I feel like if you're one of these people that is still chasing your sound and you're thinking like the next piece of gear might solve that for you, I think there's a little bit of a marketing thing that is possibly overblowing how different these things are. So if we had loads of standalone plugins which are EQ based, and say it's a multi-band EQ, it's a 10-band EQ like you get in Neural DSP or something, if they sold that as a standalone, I don't think anyone would go out particularly and buy a standalone, a 10-band EQ plugin. Likewise, if Line 6 released a 10-band EQ plugin, would you go out and buy it? Or if S-Gear kind of released these little things? To some extent, I kind of see each part of the chain in that way. So a model of a Dumble style amp is going to be within a ballpark of tones, right? It's going to have a certain amount of gain. You'll be able to tweak the treble mids and bass. if you set all the settings roughly similar, or you use your ears until you're at a point where you're happy. I don't know if you've tried this yourselves, but generally the things that I do tend to be the same across most devices, right? Most devices I'll be pushing the mids up and bringing the treble down to kind of smooth things, and I'll be going into the cab block and I'll either be moving things away from the cone, which you can do in some devices, or I'll be introducing a high cut, which is again a way to get rid of some of the fizziness and some of the kind of the things that Eric Johnson calls trash, and kind of rein in some of the ice pickiness of the bridge pickup on a Stratocaster on a single coil, and then adding things like delay and reverb. And again, once you're in the mix with these kinds of things, I don't think reverbs and delays as part of a whole are that different, if you know what I mean. Like, particularly if you're not playing like a clean part which is in isolation, then for sure you could pick out reverb differences. But once it's on like a lead tone, and once a delay is on a lead tone, for me, I don't feel like the delay is not the primary sound, so presumably doesn't make a huge difference. It's like a little bit of the kind of seasoning on the tone. So what am I trying to say? I don't know. I'm just trying to think, like, yes, a lot of what I do, particularly if I'm playing like in the style of me, will sound like this, because this is the sound that over the years I've tried to get out of each piece of gear, whether it was the Mesa Boogie Nomad when I first got that, the Pod XT Live when I had that, or the Pod HD 500X, or the Fractal FM3. The thing that I'll constantly be going for if I'm playing a solo with a bridge pickup, the Mesa Boogie Mark III, will be something with a lot of gain, or quite a lot of gain relatively, with a smooth high end and pushed mids. You know, like if you listen to someone like Alan Holdsworth, you know, his amps changed quite a lot over the years, whether it was a dual rectifier, a Yamaha DG amp, he used Marshalls as well. At a certain point, it seems that he found a way to get his tone, and he was able to get that tone with basically whatever you chucked in front of him. As someone who demos some of this gear, that might be a negative thing, but I guess the reason for the video is just kind of point out that maybe if you are looking and still chasing your tone, all of the tools are kind of already with you, probably, depending on what you've got. But like most plugins, as I say, the Line 6 Modern is kind of like a kind of metal style plugin, right? But it can still do smooth gain tones. Archetype Pliny, again, sort of metal focused. Scuffum S-Gear, classic amp kind of bass stuff. Helix Native, of course, is a very broad brush. You can do whatever you like in that, but I find that whatever device I'm using, whether it's something cheaper like the Hotone Ampero, or something more expensive like the Fractal Axe-Fx, you can get within the ballpark on most of these things. And the thing that makes the most difference of all, probably, and the thing that I didn't match across any of these, which probably would have brought things even closer, is the cab. And so if you were using the same IR over all of these, I reckon you probably even get them closer. Let me actually try that. Just a point to say, if you're still chasing something, then maybe copying some settings that you see some people do on YouTube on other devices or anything like that could still be useful for you. These tips, all of this stuff is universal. Like, none of these companies are doing anything specifically worlds different to anyone else. They're all modeling the same type of amps. They're all doing it in a similar sort of way. A lot of the hardware that they use shares a lot of things like the quad cortex, helix and affix. They share a bunch of components in there that are important to generating tone. I think the differences between these things have been sort of hyped up as part of marketing, and that is how the world works, but something as a consumer that you may want to kind of think about before you make the next purchase. Is there any of that that you strongly disagree with? And I think the most important factor when buying these things to think about is probably workflow. So things like the Strymon Iridium and the Universal Audio Dream 65, why I think they have a good kind of strong foothold in the marketplace is because some people don't want to go into a screen and, you know, build these signal chains from scratch. So workflow, I think, should be the key kind of factor for deciding between these things, or like the form factor. If you decide, right, I need to be able to fly this thing, or I need to be able to do X and Y, then that should be probably, I think, what you factor into your purchase making decisions. Probably. No one needs to own as many modelers as me, is what I'm trying to say. They all do the same thing pretty much.